I have told this story only once before, to a man who did not believe me, and who is dead now. I tell it again because the people who came after us deserve to understand what was done to us, and because I am old enough now that the fear of not being believed no longer carries much weight. My name is Sophie Voss. I was born, as far as I know, on the farm. I say as far as I know because I understand now that knowing anything about a beginning requires trusting the source that told you about it. And the source that told me about my beginning was my mother, Karin, and my mother was not, in the end, an entirely reliable narrator. I do not say that to wound her. She did what she was told. She believed what they needed her to believe. I think if she had known, really known, in the marrow of her, the way I came to know, she would have done differently. I choose to believe that. It is one of the few choices I have left. The farm sat in a shallow bowl of land at the base of a ridge that ran east to west as far as I could see in either direction. The ridge was dark stone, almost black, and it caught the permanent amber light from the horizon and held it in the mornings like a coal still warm from the previous night. There were fields of something that resembled wheat, a barn, a house of gray timber with 4 rooms and a cellar that was always cold, a well in the yard that tasted of iron. I knew these things the way you know the walls of a room you've lived in all your life, not by memorizing them, but by never having looked at anything else. My father was not there. He never had been, not in any memory I could reach. My mother explained this to me when I was very small in the careful, practiced way she explained most things, as though the explanation had been rehearsed many times before the question was ever asked. He was away, she said. He was working in a place far from us and could not come back yet. But he wrote. Every month, without fail, a letter arrived delivered, my mother said, by a writer who came while I was asleep. She would read it to me at the kitchen table, holding the paper at a slight angle as though the words were hard to see, her voice warm and steady, and the letters were always the same in their essential content. He was well, he was working hard, he thought of us constantly. He would return when he could. He loved us both beyond measure. I believed all of this. I believed it the way a child believes gravity, not as an act of faith, but as a fact so deep it predates thought. There was a box. My mother kept it in the drawer of her bedside table, the left drawer, which she never fully opened in my presence. I knew the box was there because once, when I was perhaps 7 years old, I had come into her room looking for a lost ribbon and seen the drawer ajar, seen the corner of the wooden box inside dark-stained, with a small brass clasp. When she heard me come in, she closed the drawer quickly, not with alarm but with the smooth, reflexive speed of a person who has performed a motion many thousands of times without thinking about it. She smiled at me. She asked about the ribbon. That was all. But I thought about the box. Children think about things they are not meant to have seen. It is one of the things we do best. I was 14 when I opened it. My mother had gone out to the far field to check on something. A break in the fence, she said, near the ridge. She expected to be gone most of the morning. I watched her cross the yard and pass through the gate and begin climbing the long slope, and then I went to her room. The drawer moved easily. The box was as I remembered it, dark wood, warm to the touch, the brass clasp rubbed smooth from handling. I lifted it out and set it on the bed and opened it. There were letters inside, that much was true, but there were far more of them than a single monthly letter over 14 years should have produced. Hundreds of them, folded tight, packed dense, and the dates were wrong. The oldest one I could find was dated 3 years before my birth. Some were dated in the same month, same year, the same week. And the handwriting on all of them was the same, small, precise, looping slightly on the ascenders, the same hand, every one. I read 3 of them before my hands started to shake. The words were different on the surface. Different details, different turns of phrase, different small stories about the day, but the shape underneath was identical. The rhythms were the same. The emotional register never varied, and certain phrases recurred exactly, word for word, in letters dated years apart. I felt well today. I think of the 2 of you as I fall asleep. I will come home when the work allows. I put the letters back, I closed the box, I replaced it in the drawer. I went outside and stood in the yard and looked at the ridge and the amber sky above it and tried to organize what I was thinking. The honest answer is that I could not. The thought that tried to form was too large for the shape of the world I had been living in. It did not fit. It kept pressing against the inside of my mind from an angle I didn't have a name for. What I knew, in the most stripped and mechanical sense, was this: the letters were not from my father. They had been written by someone who wrote many versions of the same letter and kept them all in a box and gave them to my mother to read to me in a scheduled rotation, so that I would believe I had a father who was away and would one day come home. What I didn't yet know was why. That part took longer. The farm's boundary was not a fence, not anywhere I had ever walked. It was simply where the fields ended and the scrub began, and past the scrub the land rose sharply to the base of the ridge. I had never climbed the ridge. My mother had never said I couldn't, which I understand now was deliberate. Nothing was ever explicitly forbidden, because explicit prohibition invites explicit interrogation. The world simply had a natural shape that ended where it ended, and I had accepted that shape without thinking too hard about its edges. After I found the box, I started thinking about the edges. I went to the ridge the next afternoon while my mother slept. It was a 40-minute walk through the scrub, which was gray-green and dry and smelled faintly of something I cannot name, not quite sulfur, not quite rot, something between the two. The ground rose steadily. The ridge above me looked exactly as it always had from the farm, which is to say dark and enormous and unremarkable in its enormous darkness. I climbed for perhaps 20 minutes before I found the wall. It did not look like a wall at first. It looked like a change in the air, a place where the amber light seemed to bend slightly, to thicken, as though the atmosphere itself was denser there. I walked toward it until I was close enough to touch it, and then I did touch it, and what I felt under my fingers was not stone or metal or glass, but something with the consistency of cold water that was inexplicably not moving. It gave slightly under pressure, perhaps 3 or 4 millimeters, and then pushed back. Not hard, gently, the way something corrects a course without drawing attention to the correction. I stood there for a long time, with my palm flat against it. Behind me the farm, the gray house, the iron-tasting well, my mother asleep. In front of me nothing I could see, just the wall and the place where the light changed. I began to understand that what I was pressed against was the inside of something. I did not scream. I do not know why, except that screaming requires a direction, and I had run out of directions. Instead, I sat down on the slope with my back to the wall and my face toward the farm, and I looked at it for a long time, really looked at it. The way you only look at something when you know you are about to stop seeing it the way you always saw it. The fields, the barn, the house. The sky that was always amber, always at the same angle of light, because there was no sun that moved, because the light did not come from a sun at all. I think that was the moment, not the box, not the letters. This moment on the slope, looking at the light that had never changed and understanding what that meant. My mother was not asleep when I came back down. She was standing in the yard, in the exact center of the yard, very still, the way she sometimes stood when she was listening for something. When she saw me coming through the gate she did not move, but her eyes changed. Something went out of them, something small but real, like a flame bent sideways by a draft. I did not ask her, I waited. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said quietly that I was not supposed to go to the ridge. I told her I hadn't been told that. She said she knew. We ate dinner. We did not speak during dinner. After dinner she sat in the chair by the window, and I sat on the floor near the stove, and eventually she said, with her eyes on the window rather than on me, that she would explain as much as she was able to explain. She explained this. She did not know who had built the farm. She had woken in the house one morning. She remembered nothing before that morning, which had been, by her reckoning, 31 years ago, and the house had been there, and the fields had been there, and the instructions had been there. The instructions were written in a language she had not known before she woke and which she knew completely the moment she opened her eyes. They were on a single sheet of paper on the kitchen table. They said, "Maintain the domestic routine. Receive the letters. Read them to the child. Do not approach the boundary. Do not explain the nature of the installation to the child. The child's perceptual integrity is essential to the record." The child, she had not been pregnant. There had been no child in the house. 2 days after she woke, I was there. She did not know how. She was simply in her room one morning, and then she was not alone. She stopped talking. I waited. She did not say anything else. I asked her what the record was. She said she did not know. I asked her who had left the instructions. She said she did not know that either. I asked her if she had ever tried to leave. A long pause. Then, she had tried to leave twice in the early years before I was old enough to remember. The first time she had walked toward the ridge until she felt very tired, profoundly and immediately tired, the way exhaustion descends in the middle of a serious illness, and she had turned back without intending to turn back. The second time she had tried to stay through the tiredness, and she had lost several days, she wasn't sure how many. She had woken in her bed with no memory of the intervening time, and a headache so severe she could not stand for most of a morning. After that she had maintained the domestic routine. I listened to all of this very carefully. Then I asked her, did she believe my father was real? She looked at her hands. She said she had needed him to be real. She said that was not the same thing as believing. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my room and looked at the ceiling and thought about what it meant to be a record. A child who had been placed in an enclosed space with a caretaker and a rotation of identical letters and an amber sky that never changed. A record of what? A record for whom? I thought about the tiredness my mother had described, the biological override that turned her back without violence, without threat, without any mechanism she could identify. Something that treated her body's own chemistry as a remote control. I thought about the wall, the cold resistance of it, the gentleness of the correction. Something very large and very patient had built this place. Something that was interested in watching, not in breaking. Whatever they were not wasteful. They had not locked the doors or posted guards. They had simply made the world end in a way that felt natural, and then waited. I did not know what I was going to do, but I knew I was going to do something. I think that was the first moment I understood that this quality, this insistence on action in the absence of any viable action, was specifically ours. It was not wisdom. It was not strategy. It was something closer to a failure to accept a situation as final that probably looked, from the outside, like stupidity. I spent the next 3 months learning the boundary. I told my mother I was going to do this, and she did not try to stop me. She asked me to take water and to be back before the amber dimmed for the night, which was the closest thing the installation had to a sunset, not the sun going down but the ambient light dropping by perhaps 30% for a few hours before returning to full. She did not ask me what I was hoping to find. I think she already knew the shape of what I was becoming, even if I didn't. The first week I walked the perimeter from end to end without touching the boundary at all, just looking at it from a distance of 5 or 6 meters. I wanted to understand it as a whole before I understood it in pieces. What I found was this. It was not a wall in any sense a wall implies. There was no seam, no visible material, no indication that it had been built rather than grown. The air simply became something else at a certain point, and the something else continued in a smooth curve around the entire installation. From outside, I assumed, I hoped, it would have been invisible. From inside it was barely visible, just a place where the amber light thickened and the shadows went a different direction. The second week I began making contact. I walked the boundary, pressing my palm flat against it every few meters, holding it there for a count of 10, recording what I felt. Most of it was the same, the cold, the slight give, the correction, but not all of it. There were zones where the temperature was different, warmer in some places, colder in others. There were places where the pushback was delayed, as though the mechanism behind it was slower to respond or more tired. I began to understand the boundary not as a thing, but as a system. And like all systems, it had variations that were the signature of age and imperfect maintenance. I walked it systematically, section by section, covering the whole perimeter of the installation. It was roughly elliptical, I estimated, about 4 kilometers on its long axis. I noted every variation I could detect. The wall was not uniform. There were places where the cold water feeling was thinner, places where the light bending was less pronounced, places where the pushback came sooner, and places where I could press my hand into the wrist before it found resistance. My mother began meeting me at the edge of the scrub when I came back each evening. She would have water and sometimes bread, and she would walk beside me back to the house without asking questions until I chose to offer what I had found. Some evenings I told her everything. Some evenings neither of us said much. The work was slow, and she understood that slowness was not failure. In the 4th week, I found something that changed the nature of what I was doing. I had been mapping a section of the northern arc where the boundary felt thinner than average. Not dramatically, not to the point where I thought it was significant, just the consistent faint sense that the resistance there was less resolved than elsewhere. I was pressing systematically along it, a few centimeters at a time, when I found a spot where my hand went into the wrist without any pushback at all. Not a gap, the boundary was still there, still doing what it did, but a place where the correction was absent, where the system that should have said no said nothing. I withdrew my hand, I pressed again, same result. I marked the spot by scraping a line in the dark stone of the ridge, with a piece of metal I had taken from the barn for exactly this purpose. Then I walked away and sat down in the scrub and thought about what it meant. A system that was failing at a point. A small failure, perhaps meaningless, perhaps only the first indication of a larger one. I did not know which, but I had learned, in 3 months of pressing my hands against the wall, that the boundary was not a dead thing. It was a maintained thing, which meant that the maintenance could succeed or fail. There was one place, near the northern end of the ridge, where the boundary did something different. It hummed. Not loudly. Not a sound you would hear from any distance. A sound you felt in the bones of your hand when you pressed against the wall, a low vibration that was almost but not quite a tone. I pressed against it many times over many weeks. I mapped it with my fingertips. It was a small patch, perhaps the size of a dinner plate, and the vibration was always there, always the same frequency, and unlike every other section of the wall, it did not push back. It did not push back. I told my mother what I had found. She listened without comment. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "What do you want to do?" I said I didn't know yet. She nodded. She went back to what she was doing. I want to record that clearly because it matters. She accepted in that moment that something was going to happen. She did not beg me to be careful. She did not tell me not to. She simply absorbed the information and waited for the next thing. My mother was braver than I understood at the time. What I had not told her was that the patch that didn't push back had been growing. Slowly, no more than a centimeter a week, but consistently. Whatever was creating the boundary was failing in that spot. Whether through age or damage or some fluctuation in whatever mechanism maintained it, the patch was weakening. I calculated, roughly, based on the rate of growth and the current size of the anomaly, that in approximately 6 more weeks the gap would be large enough for a person to push through. I was wrong about the timeline, but right about the direction. It happened in 4 weeks. The morning it happened I woke before dawn. I don't know why. There was no sound. The amber light was its usual steady self through the window, but I was awake and alert in a way that felt external, as though something had tapped me on the shoulder from the inside. I dressed. I went to my mother's room and touched her shoulder. She woke immediately, the way people wake when they are already 3/4 awake, when sleep has become something they're only maintaining out of habit. I said, "I think it's time." She sat up, she looked at me for a moment, she said, "Let me get my coat." We crossed the yard in the pre-dawn amber. The scrub was cold. I moved quickly because I knew the path now, had walked it so many times in 3 months that my feet knew it without consulting my eyes. My mother kept pace with me. She did not speak. I noticed and filed away the noticing that she was not afraid. She was something else. She was, I think, ready. The patch was where it always was. I pressed my hand against it and there was no resistance at all. My hand passed through, into cold, dark air on the other side. A sound came through, low and massive, like the held note of something vast exhaling. Nothing I had a reference for, nothing from the farm. My mother was behind me. I could hear her breathing. I pushed through the boundary. What happened on the other side is difficult to describe in the sequential way that words require because what I experienced was not sequential. It was simultaneous, everything at once and everything wrong. The space outside the installation was enormous, not a ridge, not stone. What I had seen as a ridge from inside was the underside of a structure, curved, vast, running away in both directions to a scale I couldn't process. Above me was a ceiling, except that ceiling is not the right word. Above me was the underside of everything, and it was moving slowly in a way that suggested breath or circulation, not mechanics, biology. The light that fell on the exterior surface was nothing like amber. It was a deep blue-gray, the color of water at depth, and it came from no single source but from everywhere at once, softly, the way bioluminescence moves. The farm was a bubble. That is the most accurate word, a bubble inside something alive. I could see it behind me when I turned, the whole of it at once for the first time, and it was smaller than I had expected and larger than I was ready for. The gray house, the barn, the fields, the well, all of it contained inside a slightly hazy sphere of amber light no bigger from the outside than a substantial building. The amber looked warm and golden from here, beautiful even. From outside, it looked exactly the way home is supposed to look. I turned back to the exterior. They were in the space outside, not many, 3 or 4 that I could identify in the first confused seconds, though the space was large enough to contain more. They were not what I had imagined. I had not let myself imagine because I knew imagination would give me something manageable, and nothing about them was manageable. They were tall, 4 meters, perhaps 5, but height was not the primary quality. The primary quality was patience. They gave off patience the way a coal gives off heat, steadily, without effort, as a natural property of their being. They moved with the slow certainty of things that have not needed to hurry in a very long time. They had no faces I could identify as faces. What they had instead were structures, surfaces that changed and shifted and oriented themselves toward things of interest the way a flower orients toward light. One of them was oriented toward us. The others were not. They were attending to other things. I could not see what, moving slowly through the blue-gray space with the unhurried absorption of people engaged in work they have done many thousands of times before. The space smelled of nothing I could name. The floor beneath my feet, if it was a floor, if the word applied, was neither warm nor cold but something else entirely, a temperature that registered as presence rather than temperature. I stood in the entrance of the bubble, half in and half out, with my mother's hand on my shoulder, and I looked at the one that was looking at us, and I thought with complete clarity, they did not expect this. The patience was still there, but underneath it, very faint, something had changed in the quality of their attention. We were not supposed to come out. We were not supposed to have found the gap. We were not supposed to have spent 3 months mapping the boundary and 4 weeks tracking the rate of its failure. We were not supposed to be here. I stepped fully outside. I heard a sound that I understood without being able to explain the understanding was communication. The 3 others in the space oriented toward us. The movement was slow, not threatening, but it was deliberate. They were adjusting. My mother stepped out beside me. She straightened. She looked up at the nearest one. It was close now, 12 or 15 meters, its surface structures shifting and reconfiguring, and she squared her shoulders in a way I recognized. It was the same gesture she used when she was preparing to receive something she didn't want to receive, a settling of the self. Then she began to talk. I don't know why she did it. It was not a language they could understand. She said in clear and even Swedish that we were human beings, that we were not animals in a collection and not a record for someone else's archive and not a specimen of anything at all. She said that she had spent 31 years in that room because she had not known she had a choice, and that she was standing here now because her daughter had found the choice for her. She said the name of every person she could still remember from before she woke in the house, though the names had blurred by then, and she was not certain she had them right. The ones outside had stopped moving. I don't believe they understood the words, but I believe something about what she was doing registered. The quality of their stillness changed. Something that had been processing shifted into something that was simply observing. She finished. The space was quiet except for the low exhalation of the structure around us. I looked up at the nearest one and said one word in the clearest voice I had. No. Not a refusal of anything specific. I had nothing to refuse. I could not fight them. I could not run from them. I could not negotiate. The word was not tactical. It was definitional. It was the only word I had that said what I was, which was a person who had been put in a box and had noticed the box and had decided that noticing was not enough. I don't know what they had expected. Based on what my mother told me about her 2 attempts, the engineered exhaustion, the stolen days, they had managed every previous deviation through the body's own chemistry. Clean, silent, calibrated. The deviation corrected without confrontation. What they had not, apparently, planned for was a deviation that came already knowing what it was. A deviation that walked out of the box with its eyes open and its mother beside it and a word in its throat. We were not trying to escape. There was nowhere to escape to. We were not attacking. We had nothing to attack with. We were simply refusing to go back in. The standoff lasted a long time. I cannot tell you how long because time worked differently outside the boundary and I had no reference for it. My legs ached. My mother's hand found mine. We stood. At some point, one of them moved toward us. It stopped 2 meters away. Its surface structures were close enough now that I could see them shifting in the blue-gray light, fine and complex, like the surface of water disturbed by something large moving slowly underneath. It tilted toward us, not a lean, not a threat, something more like an antenna orienting. Then it did something. It is hard to describe. It extended not physically, not a limb or appendage, but something that was present in the space between us in a way that was not light and not sound. A quality, an attention so focused and so close that I felt it the way you feel someone's gaze on the back of your neck in an empty room. Direct, specific, personal. It was looking at us, not at our bodies, not at our biology. It was looking at whatever is behind the eyes. And after a long moment, it withdrew. I don't know what it found. I have spent years trying to understand what changed in that space. The most honest answer I can give is this: something in the quality of our stubbornness, the specific, intractable human variety of refusing to resume normal behavior after you have understood that the behavior is a performance, was something they had not cataloged before. They did not let us go. That would be too clean a story. What happened was more complicated and slower and worse in some ways and better in others. The installation came down, not all at once, but over a period of what felt like several days, the boundary failing in expanding sections, the amber sky darkening and finally going out, the farm standing in the blue-gray light of the exterior, still, unfamiliar, stripped of its meaning. We were not the only ones. There were other bubbles. When I first walked the space outside, I could see them, dozens of them, translucent in the blue-gray, each one a small amber world with its own house, its own fields, its own sky that never changed. I pressed my face against one and looked inside and saw a family gathered at a table I did not recognize, a woman and 2 men and a child eating, and none of them were looking toward the boundary. The ones who built the installations, I never found a word for them that felt adequate, and so I use only what they were to us, which was wardens and architects, and in the end, something we did not have a word for. They were not cruel. That is a hard thing to say, and I say it carefully, because the thing they did to us was an immense and cold violation, and I will not soften that. But they were not cruel in the way that cruelty requires a wish to cause pain. They were simply deeply, profoundly certain that they knew what we needed, and they provided it, and they did not think to ask us whether we agreed. What broke that certainty was not our escape. It was the fact that once we were outside, we did not collapse. We did not beg to go back in. We did not perform the despair that a creature whose construct had been destroyed was supposed to perform. We stood in the blue-gray light with our eyes open, and we remained ourselves, and apparently that was a thing they had not seen before. Not the escape, the persistence. I have heard it argued in the years since that what we did was not remarkable, that any species would do the same given the same conditions. I have met people who find it comforting to believe that. I think they are wrong, but I understand the comfort. It would be convenient if what happened was simply what any intelligent creature would do when the walls came down. But my mother spent 31 years inside the walls, not because she lacked intelligence or courage, because the walls were designed to be invisible, and because the alternatives to acceptance had been made to feel impossible, and because the human need for stability and continuity is profound and real and not a weakness. The need for the letter from the absent father, the amber sky, the daily sameness, these are human things, and they were used against us precisely because they are human things, which means they understood us better than we understood ourselves. What was different about me was not that I was smarter or braver. What was different was the box, the locked drawer, the moment when I saw the corner of something I was not supposed to see and could not stop thinking about it. We think about what we are not supposed to see. We think about it until we have to do something about it. We cannot help it. It is, I believe, the single most irritating quality we possess. The other installations failed over months. Some of the people inside came out on their own. Some had to be guided. A few, and I say this without judgment, chose to stay for as long as the structure held them, because the structure was home, because it was all they had, because 30 years of amber light and iron-tasting water and a letter every month was still a life, and the blue-gray outside was enormous and strange. My mother stayed outside. She slept badly for the rest of her life. She had recurring dreams about the farm and about a man whose face she could never quite see, who was writing letters at a desk in a room she could not enter. She told me about these dreams in the same careful, practiced way she had explained everything when I was a child, and I listened in the same careful way I had always listened to her, and we did not discuss whether the man at the desk was real, because that was not a question whose answer mattered anymore. She died in her 70th year in a room with windows that looked onto a valley I can see from where I am writing this now. The windows faced east and got the morning light. Not amber, regular morning light, gray and blue and gold in its proper proportions, changing as the sun moved the way the sun is supposed to move. She loved those windows. She never said so, but I know she did because she positioned her chair to face them, and she would sit there in the mornings with her coffee and not say anything for a long time. I held her hand when she died. The room was warm and the windows were letting in the morning light, and I told her what I have come to believe is true, that she did everything they asked her to do because she believed it was for me, and that she was right, and that the thing they had not calculated was that eventually the child they were protecting would grow old enough to protect her in return. She didn't answer, She was past answering by then. The ones outside have not built another installation, as far as we know. That is not a reassurance I offer lightly. I know how much space there is between as far as we know and certainly, and I have lived too long to mistake the first for the second. But what we have seen, in the decades since the installations failed, is something more like study than like resumption. They move through our presence the way scientists move through a long-term observation site when the experiment has produced an unexpected result. Carefully, repeatedly, with a quality of attention that is no longer confident. We did not beat them. I want to be clear about that because it matters. We did not defeat them or overpower them or outmaneuver them. They were old when we were nothing, and large when we were small, and they built worlds inside other worlds to hold us, and we will live a long time in the shadow of what that means. But we surprised them. A child found a box that she wasn't supposed to find and could not stop thinking about what was inside it, and from that one small stubborn refusal to look away, everything that followed eventually followed. I am old now. The valley outside my window is going gold in the late afternoon light, the real light, the light that moves. The cold water feeling of the boundary is something I feel sometimes in my sleep, that gentle pushback, that gentle correction of course. I do not push away from it when I feel it. I push back.